The town had been silent for 20 years. No cars, no lights, no voices, just empty streets and wind moving through broken signs. Yet the moment Daniel Carter bought it, someone claimed they owned it too. Daniel had always dreamed of restoring forgotten places. When he found the listing for an abandoned desert town called Red Hollow, the price seemed unreal. Rows of empty homes, a diner, an old library, even a tiny theater, all sitting untouched for decades. He imagined rebuilding it into something warm again. A place where people could start fresh. The paperwork was simple. The county confirmed the land had no active owner. Daniel signed the documents, transferred the money, and suddenly he owned an entire town. On his first evening there, the sunset painted the empty buildings gold. Daniel stood in the middle of Main Street smiling, picturing families walking these sidewalks again. Then a letter appeared on the door of the old town hall. It was neatly typed, sealed with a blue stamp, and addressed to him. "Welcome to Red Hollow," it read. "Please be advised that all properties here are subject to the Red Hollow Homeowners Association." Daniel frowned. HOA, he checked the county records again. There was no HOA listed anywhere, but the letter ended with a line that made the quiet town feel suddenly different. Failure to follow HOA rules may result in penalties. And Daniel realized something strange. Someone out there believed they controlled his town. Daniel laughed at first. The idea seemed ridiculous. How could an HOA exist in a town that had been empty for 2 decades? Still, curiosity kept him from ignoring the letter. The next morning he walked through Red Hollow with the quiet excitement of a man exploring his own strange kingdom. Dusty storefronts lined the street. The diners still had menus sitting on the tables. It felt as if the town had simply paused and never resumed. By noon he reached the old post office. Inside, sitting on the counter, was another envelope. This one was thicker. Daniel opened it slowly. Inside was a packet titled, "Red Hollow Community Standards." Pages of rules followed. Lawns must be maintained. Exterior paint colors must be approved. Porches must display seasonal decorations. Daniel stared around at the empty town. There were no lawns. No neighbors. No decorations, yet the rules continued for 12 pages. At the bottom of the packet was a note: "An HOA representative will visit tomorrow to review compliance." Daniel felt a small chill run through him. Who would visit? And how had they known he arrived? He stepped outside and looked down the silent street. For the first time since buying the town, Red Hollow no longer felt abandoned, it felt watched. Morning arrived with soft desert sunlight and a strange feeling of anticipation. Daniel had barely slept. At exactly 9 o'clock, a car appeared on the distant road. It was the first vehicle he had seen since arriving. The sedan rolled slowly into town and stopped beside the old town hall. A woman stepped out holding a clipboard and wearing the calm confidence of someone used to being obeyed. "Good morning," she said politely. "You must be Mr. Carter." Daniel nodded. "And you are?" "Margaret Sloan, president of the Red Hollow Homeowners Association." Daniel gestured to the empty streets. "You mean the HOA for a ghost town?" Margaret smiled gently. "Red Hollow isn't a ghost town. It's a community." Daniel tried to stay patient. "I legally purchased the entire property. The county records show no HOA." Margaret opened her clipboard and showed him a document, an agreement dated 35 years ago. "The HOA was established before the town was abandoned," she explained. "And according to these documents, it still exists." Daniel frowned. "But there are no residents." Margaret looked down the quiet street and spoke softly. "There were." Then she closed the clipboard. "And the association still protects what this town was meant to become." Daniel felt a growing mystery forming around him, because if no one lived here, who exactly was the HOA protecting the town from? Daniel spent the afternoon digging through the old town hall records. Dust covered every cabinet, but the files were surprisingly organized. Red Hollow had once been a hopeful place. 30 homes built for families working at a nearby mine. A small school, a diner, a park with swings that still creaked in the wind. Then, suddenly, everything stopped. The mine closed. Families moved away. Within a year, the town was empty, yet the HOA records continued for decades. Monthly notes. Maintenance logs. Meeting summaries. Someone had been managing this town long after everyone left. Daniel looked at the signatures. Every single report was signed by the same person, Margaret Sloan. 35 years of HOA meetings. Attended by one woman, that evening Daniel found Margaret sitting on the steps of the diner watching the sunset. "You've been running this town alone?" he asked. Margaret nodded calmly. "Someone had to." "But why?" Daniel asked. Margaret looked down the quiet street with a soft expression. "Because this town was never supposed to disappear." Daniel sat beside her. "Then help me bring it back." Margaret stayed silent for a long moment, then she said something unexpected. "I've been waiting a long time for someone to say that." The next weeks changed Red Hollow in ways Daniel never expected. Margaret knew every building, every pipe, every faded sign. She had spent decades quietly protecting the town from vandals, keeping records, and paying small taxes just to keep the HOA alive. "Most people thought I was strange," she admitted one morning, "but I always believed someone would come." Together they started small. They cleaned the diner first. Then the library. Daniel repaired lights while Margaret organized shelves that hadn't been touched in 20 years. Word slowly spread online about the man rebuilding an abandoned town. Visitors began arriving out of curiosity: artists, travelers, families looking for a fresh start. Each time someone showed interest, Margaret carefully handed them the same HOA packet Daniel had received. But now the rules felt different. They weren't about control, they were about protecting the town's character. One evening, as lights began glowing in 3 newly restored houses, Daniel looked down the street with quiet pride. Red Hollow was waking up. Margaret stood beside him smiling softly. "You see?" she said. "The HOA was never the problem." Daniel nodded slowly, but there was still one question he couldn't stop thinking about. "Margaret, why did you care so much about this place?" Her answer revealed the truth Daniel had never imagined. Margaret walked Daniel to the small park at the edge of town. The swings moved gently in the evening wind. "My parents helped build this town," she said quietly. "They believed it would become something special." She pointed to the empty houses. "I grew up here. Every birthday, every memory. All of it happened in Red Hollow." When the mine closed, families began leaving. One by one the houses emptied. Margaret's parents stayed until the very end. Before they moved away, her father helped create the HOA, not to control people, Margaret explained, but to protect the dream of this town. After her parents passed away, Margaret returned every year. At first it was just visits. Then she started maintaining records, paying small fees, writing HOA reports even when no one attended. "I suppose it became my promise to them," she said softly. Daniel looked around at the lights slowly returning to the town. "You didn't keep the HOA alive to control Red Hollow," he realized. Margaret shook her head. "I kept it alive so the town would still belong to a community." When the community finally returned, Daniel finally understood the strange letter on the town hall door. It wasn't a warning, it was an invitation, and Red Hollow was finally ready for its next chapter. A year later, Red Hollow was no longer silent. Children rode bikes down Main Street. Music played from the diner on Friday nights. The library hosted book clubs, and the old theater showed movies again. New families moved in slowly, each one adding life back to the forgotten town. Daniel often stood at the same spot where he first read the strange HOA letter. What once felt mysterious now made perfect sense. The HOA had never been about rules, it had been about protecting the spirit of the town until someone cared enough to rebuild it. Margaret still served as HOA president, but now the meetings were full of laughter and neighbors sharing ideas. One evening Daniel asked her if she ever imagined the town would look like this again. Margaret smiled as lights glowed across the street. "I never stopped imagining it," she said. Daniel realized something powerful. He hadn't just bought an abandoned town, he had stepped into a story someone had been protecting for 35 years, and because one person refused to let the dream disappear, an entire community had returned, and that was the final twist in this unbelievable HOA story. If you love the drama, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment sharing your thoughts. It really helps this channel grow.